that leads us into our second topic today, Ethan. And this is something that has kind of become more legitimate to me over the course of the season. And that's basically, y'all see it in the title if you're watching, and it says Offseason Moves Incoming. And I'm just basically going to ask this question, Ethan, and then we're going to dive into the ins and outs of it. But essentially, because of how good Victor already is, how he's progressed, how much he wants to win, the situations that he's put us in, not the last Rockets game on Tuesday, but the one last week where you did the post game. One of my friends was talking about it, and you were talking about it as well. The Rockets were able to just clog the paint, leave Trey Jones and Jeremy Sohan open. Now, granted, I will say, Jeremy Sohan shooting this season with the improvement it's made, if he can do that again, I think there's potential there for him to just at least be a respectable shooter. And Trey Jones shot really well in the Rockets game, I do have to say. But overall, able to clog the paint, leave those guys open. We're not able to make them pay. But the bigger point is, with how good Wemby already is, the excess, keyword here, excess of assets that the Spurs have acquired with the DeJounte Murray trade, the DeMar DeRozan trade, the Derek White trade, the Jakob Poeltl trade. You could even go back to the Kawhi trade if you want to. Do the Spurs make a move this offseason? A big splashy move, if you will. And when I say that, it doesn't even have to necessarily be like a high caliber all-star, but somebody like a move that brings in a significant upgrade in talent and signals a change in philosophy with the team next season.
It's a great question, Jude. I think the apprehension from some Spurs fans, including myself a little bit, I can see both sides, is the Spurs have always been process-oriented. We've always put the front office and the coaching staff's thought process first before the players, and we've always had, thankfully, players that understand that and are willing to play along. And it's been successful. 5 championships later, 20 seasons, 50 wins in a row. It's been successful, clearly. We have a lot of young talent. We have a lot of assets. There's a part of me that says, you know what, let's just play it out. Let's just play it out. Let's continue doing what we're doing, drafting high, building players around Wemby that they can grow together. And I completely see the logic behind that. I'm not against that. However, I think with where the league is currently, with who Victor Wembanyama is, he's not Tim Duncan. He's more he's a very smart, mature man for his age, but he's also extremely competitive, a little more vocal, I feel. He has a camp. Like Tim Duncan, you never heard a word out of him, right? He was just like, I'm here to play basketball, pop at RC, y'all do everything else. I don't care. I will compete no matter who I'm with. Wemby wants to win. And at a certain point, you're going to have to make moves. So my thought process is, yes, a move will be made this summer. I don't think it'll be a free agency move. I think that there will likely be a trade. I don't know for who or what we're giving up, but I have to see that the Spurs are making a move this offseason, Jude. Yes.
And this has been a big thing that's been talked about in the Spurs world. And if you've watched this channel for a while, you know that, I mean, I've even, in the last time where we kind of discussed this conversation, I believe it was in the Trae Young video, I made it clear, like I'm not necessarily this guy who's like, oh, we got to accelerate the timeline right now. Or even over the past couple years, since we've been doing SSPN, since 2021, like we've heard people say that, oh, like we need a big contingent of the Spurs fan space. That's what I mean when I say people. Like even in years past, like when DeJounte was still here, oh, we need to make a big trade. Even after DeJounte leaves, oh, we need to make a big trade. You know what I mean? Or after Derek leaves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we've never really been that. I would say that we've embraced the rebuild. But what I will say is over this season and really in the past like month and a half, I would say, I don't want to say this was like a light bulb moment because I see some comments that we're already getting, and I think that there's some good points being made. Like I'll bring this up right now from blah, blah, blah. He says, I think it's silly to think that the Spurs could suddenly just compete with Wemby and another player, especially Trae Young, We are not that close. We shouldn't rush, make a splashy move. And that's what we're going to get into. We're going to get into the pros and cons. Like I asked you, what do you think? And then now we'll get into the pros and cons, right? And I'll give what I think as well, just to answer that question also. And I think that that's a good point that he brings up. But with that being said, with what we've seen from Victor and what I was when I was talking about the light bulb moment earlier, I don't know if it might have been the Thunder game.
Mm-hmm.
Was that the first game when we were back at home, or was that both? Was
Yes,
that
that
the
was home.
Pacers game?
That was home because he was like, I love this blank.
Okay, that's the moment. That's the game, right? Yeah. I saw his passion, and like obviously he's wanted this all year, but that combined with the progression of his, I know it's been a rough season. The Spurs are what? Let's pull up the record here. They're 14-52.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, that it's when you say the progression, some people be like, "Oh, well, what progression are you talking about?" If you've been a diehard Spurs fan and you've actually watched the games this season, you have seen a complete progression, even with the team, not just with Victor, but with the team since moving him to the center position. Obviously, there haven't been a lot of wins, and that kind of ties into what you talked about whenever it came to the state of the league and why you kind of think that they will make this move. And that at the end of the day is also kind of why I think they will end up making a move either. I don't know if it'll be Trae Young, you know. I don't know exactly. Like maybe it's not as splashy as we think, but I think that the Spurs here's the other aspect of this that I haven't brought up yet. We're not going to be able to pay everybody we've drafted. So eventually we're going to probably want to move some of these guys or we're just going to let them go for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why when I opened this up, I said excess of assets. And we'll get into some other things too. But I'm thinking about if you could bring in like a relatively all-star level point guard. I'm not even saying Trae Young. This is totally theoretical. An offensive initiator, and you're able to keep Devin in that move, and then you can have two shooters and an actual playmaker to put next to Victor. Like your teams aren't going to be able to clog the paint like they were, like we were mentioning earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And Wemby's not going to get like I want him to get rewarded whenever he's trying as hard as he is. I know that he's someone who's got a really level head and is understands the process and grew up loving the Spurs. But you don't want to waste this opportunity, and you want to show to him at the same time that, hey, like we want to reward you for all of the good things that you do. We don't want teams to just be able to run this defense and then, your teammates can't execute, and maybe down the line in their careers, they'll be able to, but at this point, unfortunately, that's a scheme that's been effective.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think just with 2 straight seasons going the way that they have, I think also that that'll have another kind of sense of urgency, if you will, added to it. But it's more just about how good Victor is.
Yeah.
That and wanting him. I don't want I know I'm kind of rambling here,
Oh, you're
but
good.
this is how I'll wrap it up. I don't want teams to be able to just put out schemes to put other guys in positions or to put other guys in positions to where they have to make plays and those guys aren't able to.
Mm-hmm.
Because then all of the good stuff that he does, you're not taking advantage of it to an extent. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it does. And we've seen that happen before. I think the biggest example is LeBron James, his first stint in Cleveland. Like, I know he made it to one finals run, but they didn't really make trades for a little while. I guess they eventually did when they brought in an old Shaq, but we're not going to bring in a
Right.
39-year-old Shaq, right? We're smarter than that. I think they also brought in a Antoine Jameson, who was also way past his prime. But they were forced to do that because of poor decisions they made early in his career. Um, and I think the key thing that you had just said there, when you said, I don't know if it'll be Trae Young or a big splashy move, I don't think it has to be. I think that's the biggest thing. It can be something small. It could be a point guard, like you're saying, like a fringe all-star level player. It could be something else. Like I think Victor Wembanyama's point in the comments is completely valid when he says Brian Wright aiming for a dynasty. You don't build a dynasty the Suns or Lakers route. You build a dynasty the Nuggets and Warriors and OKC route. I see where he's coming from, but here's what I come back with. The Nuggets traded for Aaron Gordon. The Warriors, right before they went on their run, traded for Andre Iguodala. And OKC traded for their best player, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Like, I know he was still young, but all three teams made trades early to combine with their young core and then take that next step. And I don't think Andre Iguodala's was a huge move at the time. I even remember distinctly watching a video, but pre the season they went on that first amazing run, and they were like, "Nah, he's not going to be that big of a difference maker." They lost key players like Jarrett Jack. Like, imagine this back then. They lost Jarrett Jack. They lost Carl Landry. Like, they're going to implode. And no, they went on one of the greatest runs of all time, right? And I think that's a great valid point. But on the other hand, just to bring up the con, like you were saying, we saw a team make a similar move last year in the offseason. They went and signed Fred VanVleet, and they went and signed, what's the old boy's name?
Dylan Brooks.
Dylan Brooks. Two veteran players, a fringe all-star point guard, and a veteran 3-and-D, culture guy in Dylan Brooks. And how are they doing right now?
I'm pulling it
Not
up.
very well. They're 11th out of the play-in by 4 games. And I don't think they're going to be able to make the play-in tournament. And I know their process is kind of similar to what we were saying. Like, they had 2 really good young players in Alperen Sengun and Jalen Green. They were like, we want to make a push to compete. We've been tanking too long. And they're ready to take that next step. Let's surround them with veteran players that can teach them how to compete and win. I don't think it's escalated to the point that they were hoping it would, which is why I understand where guys are coming from when they say just play it safe, how we've been doing it, don't make a move.
Yeah. The one thing I will say about the Rockets thing, and we'll see how it plays out, because maybe it just doesn't work out and then they're just stuck in mediocrity,
Yeah.
or fighting for the play-in again next season. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, why did we make these moves?
Exactly.
Which is kind of what blah, blah, blah is saying here. He says Rockets are exactly the example to avoid. They ruined their young core development just to pretend to be better.
We don't want that.
Here's the flip side, though. What have the past couple Rocket seasons been like? Probably like close to 60 loss seasons the past 2
Mm-hmm.
years,
Yeah.
past maybe even longer than that, right? But if you want to look at the Thunder's trajectory, what did they do last season? They were the 10 seed, I'm pretty sure. And I know that the Rockets are the 11 seed, but in this is a different West than even last season. You know what I
True.
mean? When it comes to depth. So maybe next year is the year that the Rockets make the jump. But also, like we were just pointing out earlier, maybe it's not, and they're reminiscent of the Kemba Walker Hornets.
Mm-hmm.
If
Yeah,
you remember that.
I do. And the last point I want to make real quick, I personally have nothing against taking our time, playing out the rebuild, not making a trade. Nothing wrong with that. I think it would probably work. In a couple years, we'd probably be exactly where we want to be, right? In like 3 or 4 years,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. Where I come back to being pro trade slightly, and like I said, not saying it has to be Trae Young. It could be just a role player, a solid veteran. But where I come back to that point is Victor Wembanyama is a different breed, and I don't want him to feel like we're not exploring every avenue to get better and compete and surround him with winning talent. Because I do think, as much as I love him and love his maturity, I do think he's the type to make noise if he doesn't feel like the front office is doing everything they can to win. Does that make sense?
Yes, and here's the other thing. He's going to be the most coveted free agent of all time,
Mm-hmm.
potentially. That's the other thing we got to remember, too. Like, there's going to be every big team is going to offer him like a gigantic bag. And I wholeheartedly believe that the Spurs are actually going to get an extension done before all that. And it'll
Mm-hmm.
be like one of the craziest extensions probably ever announced
Probably.
at the time that it's announced, just because with his French connections, the picture of him in the Tony jersey when he was young, the him fist pumping when the Rockets didn't get the first pick. Like, you know what I mean? This all Boris. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
connections just go on and on. I think this is where he wants to be. I really do.
I do too.
And I think this is where he wanted to be coming into the league. That's what he said himself. But like you said, he respects himself at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some things you got to do. The other thing that when it comes to this trade, I think there's a potential that you could do a trade to get some potential, whatever it may be, but an upgrade at
Mm-hmm.
specific positions, whether it's shooting wise, intangibles, etc. I
Mm.
think you could do that and still keep the Spurs pick that they have this season, which they're probably going to have the highest odds. They'll have the top 3 odds for the lottery
Mm.
when it plays out. And even if they don't, it's going to be a very high pick. Most likely, it'll be a top 5 pick. Um, I don't think that the Spurs are going to strike lightning twice. I don't know if
Mm.
that's ever happened in NBA history. Um,
Once.
who was it?
Cleveland, Anthony Bennett, Andrew Wiggins, back-to-back years.
Gosh. Well, now you've got my conspiracy brain running
But they
because
traded both of those guys.
who did they end up getting? Who did
Kevin
Cleveland?
Love.
Oh, but you see what I'm saying? That was all set up after LeBron signed with them.
Mm-hmm. So it could be a combo. I know I said I don't think we're going to sign a free agent just because we historically haven't, other than LaMarcus Aldridge. But I think that I don't know the full details, but the new what do you call it?
CBA.
CBA. You kind of have to spend your money. Like you can't just sit on it anymore. So maybe what we do is we use free agency period to fill in our role players, and then maybe we have to trade some of our younger role player assets with maybe a mixture of draft capital to go after a bigger splash. And maybe it's not this offseason, but down the line it's probably going to happen.
Remind me what I was just talking about right before we got to that point.
You're like, I don't think we're in the lottery odds for the top 3, but you didn't think it was going to happen.
Yes. I mean, and we'll have to see. Like you said, maybe free agency is the move. But the bigger point I was getting at there is I think there's a potential that the Spurs make a move like this and still use their top pick,
Mhm. Yeah,
which allows you to kind of add 2 stars. It allows you to kind of play the game of both a little bit because you're adding another super young talent, but you're also and also he'll have a full rookie contract. A lot of these other guys, their contracts are winding down. As much as I mean, look at this point after this season, we're going to be in the 3rd year for Blake, Malachi, and Jeremy. That means there's only like a year left on the team option, which means we're basically already in extension talk time potentially.
yeah.
Are you going to be able to pay all 3 of those guys? I hate to bring that up right now, but it's a little closer than we think. You know what I mean? So maybe and maybe it's not those guys. Maybe it's someone like Keldon. I just really doubt that Devin is going to be in any trade talks whatsoever. And we've talked about this at nauseum before. He just fits next to whoever we bring in because of his shooting and off the dribble scoring ability. Um, and also because he can kind of play the 2 or the 3 too. I saw
Mhm.
somebody else was talking about that earlier, like maybe even because of Devin's versatility, if we wanted to, we could move him to the 3 if we brought somebody else in that plays the 1 or the 2. I don't think that that's necessarily going to happen, but the point is that Devin is very versatile when it comes to roster building on top of being having all-star potential. Um, Potentially. He's at the least a 20-point scorer and a solid defender. I think he's proven that at this point at 23, and I think he's only going to get better under the Spurs development. That's why I say I think he has all-star potential. But with all of that being said, Ethan, what are your thoughts on that draft pick in this conversation is I guess what I'm asking.
If we can hold on to it, I think that's amazing. Like you said, to bring in a potential top 3 pick and then also make a trade to bring in a nice veteran piece that can help us win now. I think that wins on both fronts. Because, like you said, we're not going to have enough roster space, let alone money, to pay everybody or draft everybody that we have enough assets for. Um, so I think that's a win-win. If we can get away with it, we can get away with it. I think if we are to make a big splash play, however, it's likely that pick will have to be included. But the whole big splash play, it's so here and there. Like there's so little you can actually like that's tangible you could talk about. Like Trae Young's the big one, right? That's the one everyone's talking about. I personally really, really like Trae Young. I think he would help our team a lot. I think he solves a lot of our problems, considering he's made it to the playoffs pretty consistently. Went to the Eastern Conference Finals when he was the only star on his team. I think he gets a lot of unwarranted hate. But other than him, I don't really know of anyone else that's currently available, right?
Yeah.
So we can't even speculate. Like, would you include this pick for blank player or blank play? Like, we can't even have those conversations because, as far as I know, there's really no other All Star point guard players on the trading block.
Yeah, not as far as I know either. Now, granted, I will say in the off season, a lot of times that kind of stuff becomes a little bit more public knowledge with all of the whether it's the draft and people talking to each other. Obviously, there's a lot of moves made on the draft as well. But even at like summer league and stuff, you start to hear like these storylines come out at all of these like kind of conference like events, even though they're not conferences. It's just like events throughout the off season that a lot of like front office staff are at. Like I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, whether it's the draft or the combine or summer league, whatever it may be. Um, but I'm completely losing my train of thought
I
here,
think you were just
Ethan.
going to say there may be some storylines where people are available once we get into the offseason, after the playoffs.
Yes, that we could figure out who, like you were saying, you don't know who's available. We could end up finding that out. That is a potential as well. But the other thing is when maybe the Spurs start floating their packages as well in
Mm,
these conversations, like if you know, of course, if the Spurs decide to do this. That's another thing. I've been talking about it in this tone. You also reiterated this. I'm not going to be mad also if they just decide to ride it out and, you know, kind of bring everybody back for next year. And maybe the my thought going into this season of everything meshing together better and them clicking and competing for the play in, maybe that does end up happening. I think that's a little sunshine and rainbowy, to be completely
mm,
honest with you. I think probably if we bring back this year's team, I think probably like around 30 wins is a little bit more of a realistic goal, if I'm being just completely honest. Because this season, I got to be humbled somewhat
mhm,
with how the predictions this season went. But that aside, it's just it'll be interesting to watch. I guess that's really and you don't know what's tangible and what's not, like you were saying. But once we start floating out some packages, this is what I was trying to get to.
mhm.
You know, there might be some people who weren't necessarily available before, but maybe some GMs look at that and be like, well, if we got some of those guys, I think that might actually be a better fit for our team, like in Atlanta, for example. And I know that's not even to just bring up the Trae Young thing again, because I see some comments that we have in here too of people being like, I'm not very fond of Trae Young's defense, and I understand what you're saying, and I understand what Ethan's saying too. And I will say that I think if you're going to bring in somebody with defensive woes, I think putting him next to Victor is probably the best scenario where you could do that. But that's really all besides the point. I just bring up Atlanta as an example of a team that is kind of wanting to maybe restructure things right now.
Mhm.
And there's some other ones out there as well, or maybe some that are kind of coming into that realization, like maybe like the Suns or something. Some of these teams that are in the play in right now that have constructed these big rosters, you know, with all these big contracts, maybe they might think it might be better for them to kind of restructure some things and add in some more role players next to some of their guys.
Mm,
Long-winded way of saying that. I think Minnesota last season, like maybe an example of that. Um, and we saw that worked out for them this year. So,
mhm.
and then that was a little bit different because they had to adjust with Rudy and Cat. But the point that I'm trying to make here is there might be some teams that want to reshuffle things, see the deal that the Spurs have with the young guys on the potential package, having potential for their team and thinking that it fits well. So that's a long-winded way of saying that. But
Time will tell. And just to speak on Trey Young's defensive lapses and whatnot, if you're going to get someone that's not very good at defense, might as well grab a guy that's averaged 30 and 10 before, led the league in assists, taken his team to the Eastern Conference Finals, and is regarded as probably the one of the top 5 point guards in the NBA, I would say.
yeah, I think him and Wemby in a
So,
two-man
oh
game,
my
like,
God.
yeah.
It would
That's
be
going to make
insane.
up for whatever points he gives up. And
Mhm.
also, I think that Wemby is going to be able to block a lot of shots if he gets beat off the dribble. But I also think that the Spurs development staff and the Spurs coaching staff would make him a little bit better defensively. Call
Mhm.
me crazy. But I
I don't think.
understand people's apprehensions, especially like if you're able to go make a move like that, maybe there's somebody else that is available that doesn't, you know, have that can score. That's a volume scorer that also is a good defender. But that ties back into what you were saying earlier. We don't really know who's available.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyways,
No, you're right. Like a lot of people want to say Tyrese Halliburton. This isn't 2K. He's not available. Like there's no package we can give up unless we include Victor Wembanyama that Indiana's going to say yes to.
yeah, that sums it up perfectly there, Ethan. You just we don't really know, but I wanted to describe it as a big splashy move because at the end of the day, the potential trade that we're talking about is something that would upgrade Victor's supporting cast so that the schemes that have been put against us this season aren't able to just be spammed and work every game next year.
Well said, my friend.
Here is one maybe potential thing, and I've heard this before, but Andrew Camarillo says Darius Garland or Donovan Mitchell may become available if the Cleveland postseason goes sideways. And I think if that happened, I would definitely lean to Darius Garland. There's some other people saying that, but this is also a big if because if Cleveland puts it together and like makes the Eastern Conference Finals, then they're going to want to keep everybody. So, but that's also why when we were talking about it earlier, as the postseason plays out, it'll become a little bit more clear who's potentially available.
I think the Cleveland situation will much more likely come down to not Cleveland picking one or the other, but Donovan Mitchell saying deuces. And then they'll be like, okay, well, we're keeping Darius Garland now because we need him.